All right, so this little presentation is going to be about basically basics of AI. So won't be getting into a whole lot about tools or ethics or anything like that at this time, but I do plan on having future sessions getting into some of those areas as well. All right, so we're going to start with our goal. Oh, let's see. All right, hold on a minute. All right. All right, so our goal is to demystify AI by exploring what AI is, how it works, where it shows up in your daily life, and how it intersects with education. So we're going to start off with a poll here. If you could, you can scan the QR code. That will take you to our Mentimeter, and you can participate in our poll here, or you can go to the website that's posted at the bottom. I'll leave this up for a moment, let everyone have a chance to give their little vote. Let's take a look here. Excuse me while I'm scooting some stuff around. Let's take a look here. All right, so I'm seeing one person voting for, is that a brand of abacus? In other words, don't really know anything about it. All right, don't see anyone voting for that was a good movie, meaning you've heard of it. 5 voting for ChatGPT is fun. In other words, you have played with AI before. And 1 person saying I'm vibe coding on Replit, which means you really know your stuff already about AI, and so hopefully I'll have something in here that you haven't already heard about. So, all right. Get out of that one. We'll go back to the presentation. All right, so what is AI? The Oxford English Dictionary defines it as the capacity of computers or other machines to exhibit or simulate intelligent behavior, etc. So I thought it might be kind of interesting. You can read the rest of the definition there on the screen, but I thought it might be interesting to actually ask ChatGPT to define what artificial intelligence is and see how it defines it. And an interesting quirk maybe about AI is that sometimes being polite is actually beneficial with getting good results from AI at the moment. Hence my please define. So it defines it as the branch of computer science focused on creating machines or software that can perform tasks typically requiring human intelligence. including things like learning, reasoning, problem solving, understanding language, etc. And then shows here learning from data, machine learning, understanding natural language, perceiving the environment, reasoning and making decisions, and planning and adapting to new situations. Also say, anytime that you have any thing that you are asking AI, it will usually ask you like some follow-up questions that allows you to expand on concepts and ideas and improve upon maybe your results by asking some more specific questions or rewording your questions so that you get a different result. Okay, so now that we've gotten our definition of what it is, I forgot the handout in my office. I'll get those at the end here. So we've got some frequently used terms here. Artificial intelligence, which we've already talked about. Machine learning, which is the process of having the machines using data to improve upon models to make the connections in artificial intelligence. Generative AI, which is probably the most common form of AI for most people, is where it will take input from a person and then based on what it has learned through a learning environment will process and expand on an answer, generating an answer, an image, a question, etc. Large language model is the model that is used by a lot of the AIs that people are becoming familiar with, like ChatGPT and Claude and Gemini. It's using a large number of a large amount of data to be able to formulate answers and generate output. A prompt is like when I asked ChatGPT to define what AI is, that's just the process of putting out or generating a question for it to answer. And prompts can be very complex and involved. Actually, the more details you can provide it, the better results you will get. So the training data is just the data that is provided to the large language model to help it learn how to process the information. Bias is an issue that you get with the training data and those who help train it. So I'll get into this a little bit more in a little bit, but the bias is coming from the fact that to train these AI models, you have to input large amounts of information, and a lot of it is just being scraped from the internet. So obviously, if you have a lot of biased information already on the internet going into the system, you're going to have all those biases then forming within the model itself. And then it's also a process of having a person, or a lot of people actually, who are then training the model with the data to help it create its various links. And those people have their biases as well. A hallucination is when it creates an artificial answer. It's making up stuff. We see this a lot when people unfortunately try to use ChatGPT or Claude or a number of these AIs to try to write a paper and get good citations with their paper. It just can't really do it very well.
Good.
Pattern recognition is the process of it, after it's been trained, being able to recognize a pattern and use that to generate output. And the algorithm is the coding that allows it to be able to understand how to do that output. I then provide some bonus terms that are not in this handout. Agentic AI, which is a much more complex version of AI. It's using multiple inputs to result in output. I'll get into that a little bit in a moment. Tokens are basically the data that's going in is being broken down into lots of different elements, and those are each tokenized and given a way of the system to interact with it as knowing, okay, this word is this token, this word is that token, these relate to each other in a particular way. Vibe prompting is kind of using the AI to help you generate better prompts. And vibe coding is using AI to basically get started with some coding for a program. Okay, so we've got two main types of AI here. And actually, there's multiple ways of looking at AI that could break it down, but we've got generative AI, which is generating words, images, audio, video, etc. It's reactive based on what the user is inputting into the system. So examples are ChatGPT, Claude, Google Gemini. Then you have agentic AI, and agentic AI is having input from multiple sources and is proactively anticipating output and what to do with that information. So the examples are, you've got your self-driving cars, it's getting multiple input from different sensors and devices, and proactively deciding, okay, need to turn right here. Oh, there's a car there, I need to avoid that. You got your automated home systems and your virtual customer service agents.
Oh,
All right, so next thing here, I'm going to try to move that over there. All right, so I've got another Menti here. If you want to scan this QR code or enter the URL, this is a word cloud. Let us know where you are encountering AI. And you might be, I think you probably can enter in multiple things, multiple words or multiple cycles of answering this. Give everyone a moment here. Everywhere. All right, so looks like we're getting like customer service, school, everywhere, work, phone answering systems, art, job, self-driving cars, distilling data, planning, number of different places here. Facebook, all right.
is AI rearranging the input there?
The input there. I'm not sure if AI is doing that.
It's just
That may be just
program.
part of the algorithm to
Okay.
rearrange that. Anyone, while typing, have autocorrect do anything with what you entered in there? Because that's AI right there in your phone.
And it's maddening.
Yeah. So it's probably in a lot of places you're not even thinking of, as we're seeing here. Obviously, a lot of stuff with autocorrect. Okay, yeah, that just got put in there. Yeah, so number of places that you'll be seeing AI. Honestly, probably just about any big box store you walk into, you're going to be encountering AI. Probably in ways you don't even realize. About 10 years ago, I had a training session with uh, dealing with Google Drive and had a presenter who is talking about their great photo app within Google Drive and about how you can enter in that in this picture you've got such and such person, and even as a baby, it would then years later be able to identify that person through AI as being that same person. And he said, I know that sounds a little scary, but pretty much any big box store that you are walking into has a camera system that's a lot more advanced than that, and they know who you are and what you're buying and all sorts of stuff. So it's just generally out there in a lot of everyday things. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a scary thing. It's just what's out there. All right, so using AI effectively. Currently, in my opinion, it's best when it augments human abilities. I would say at this time, it's probably best not to go, oh, I'll just have AI do my job for me, and I can kick back and relax at home or take a nap in my office. You're probably not going to get great results that will keep you in your job or keep you doing well in school or anything like that. But using it to like supplement what you are doing and giving some ideas and so on can be helpful. For example, to work on this presentation, I actually asked AI to help me come up with an outline and some ideas of what to talk about. And it gave me some of the things here. I did not, just take what it gave me and use just what it gave me as my presentation. I then supplemented that and reworked it and made it into something that was going to be a little more accessible and less machine thinking. So it's great for working on writing prompts and outline ideas, refining your plans, finding related research paper information. So there are some great tools out there for finding research. So it'll reduce the time that you need to spend trying to track down research because it shows you linked areas of information. Create starter codes for programs, summarizing information, generating images, etc. And there are, like I mentioned, lots of great tools out there. And to that end,
Excuse me a minute. What is starter code?
So starter code is I had briefly mentioned vibe coding at the beginning, and so that's where you're providing some input into an AI system like ChatGPT or Claude, and saying, I want to create a computer program that does X, Y, and Z, and it will generate some initial code that you can then work on expanding to create a software program, basically.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I'm going to, at this moment, bring up that I have created an artificial intelligence and education library guide, which is available through the website, the library website. When you go into the library page from the main page, leopard links about halfway down is library. On the right-hand side, you'll see a menu, and the second to the top item is library guides. And that's where, when you click on that, you'll find this guide. And so I've got a variety of information here. If you want to explore some of it, what is ChatGPT? Talks about hallucinations, large language models, ethical considerations, and tools. I've got a number of different tool areas here. So I mentioned this in case anyone is inspired by this and wants to do a little bit more exploring. Like I said, I do plan on doing some future presentations on breaking down some information about tools and ethics and such as well. All right, so question is, does AI actually think? And the short answer is no. It is just an algorithm working off of training data, coming up with what it believes it generates what it believes is the logical next piece of information to expand on ideas that are coming through. So it's trained on patterns. The training links associated data through tokenization, and that's where I was talking about. Tokenization is the breakdown of each word or each phrase or concept being a token, and so it's trained on seeing that if you have something about AI, it may also see a token linked to that about ChatGPT and Claude and vibe coding and things like that. And it can start drawing on that and generate information. Output is human-like, but there are telltale signs. It tends to not flesh out ideas, be repetitive in what it provides and output. Certainly our experiences when you try to do, say, a research paper, you'll get a lot of hallucinations, especially with citations. I frankly have not been able to find an AI that can put something out with accurate citations yet. I've also had experience where I have provided AI with a document and asked it to summarize it, and its output has been laughably inaccurate. That is not to say that AI isn't great for a lot of other stuff, just not for certain things yet.
Okay.
Yes.
AI, I always contended to when computers started coming in, people talking about how smart they were. Well, they're not smart.
No.
They're what people put into them. They're no
Exactly.
smarter than the guy that programmed them, and probably less so because his complete IQ is not there.
Right.
The other thing is they can't make an intuitive leap.
Not yet. Not yet. Although
They're working on it.
there are some AIs that are starting to show glimmers of it. And so there's also this concept called the singularity, where AI reaches a level where it is able to actually have a sentience to it. There are some people who believe that that is going to happen within as soon as a year's time. I am not some people. I think it's going to take a while longer for it to get to that point. But it is something that may be around the bend. And at that point would be able to make those logical leaps of to other concepts and ideas and such. All right. So as I've kind of already mentioned, AI has its limitations. It's only as good as the input that it has. And so if in many cases in these large language models, like I said, they are scraping information all off of the internet. And if any of y'all have ever been in Reddit or blogs of various sorts or anything like that, you have probably encountered some less than accurate information. So it's getting a lot of its training data from those sources. So it's going to have its limitations. It's going to have those existing biases that were in those answers, those questions, things in Quora that can be very controversial and biased. When Gen AI doesn't know how to respond, it will hallucinate an answer. It's not really set up to say, I don't really have a good answer for you. Why don't you, try doing this search instead? It will try to provide you an answer, which is part of why it's so terrible at providing citations, because it's not always pulling from actually citable sources. And so it can't then provide the citation because it's not pulling just from one source. And then there are ethical concerns about AI. Kind of as I've been saying, the training process, the biases of the data and of the human draining it. It requires a huge amount of power to the point that AI companies have talked about considering restarting 3 Mile Island for the energy production to be able to have their data centers to work on all this. It uses a huge amount of water to cool all of that. And so in some areas, there's significant concerns about the water usage to keep these things going. And then you've got the copyright violations that can happen.
Yeah.
You've got all this data that's being pulled off the internet, and none of it is citing who created it and providing any information that that person should be credited with having provided the information that allowed it to give that answer. So yeah, you've got a lot of stuff with that. All right, so I have also been seeing that there have been a number of questions coming up. Let me pull up the chat. Okay, it looks like Mia has been providing some links to library guides and things like that. Okay, cool. I saw some chats, stuff was coming up, was just checking on that. Does anyone have any questions at this time? I mean, like I said, this is kind of the basics, and I'll have future sessions where I get into more specifics, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have at the moment.
I only have two comments.
Okay.
One is about, I'm sure you've read this, HAL computer in 2001. And the other one is a movie. And I can't remember the name of it, not, million years ago. And it was about a computer that had gone rogue and was able to protect itself. So that, the last thing to shut a computer down is pull the plug. And this computer had arranged things where you couldn't pull the plug. And at the end, the humans have a plan. They set off to boot, to take care of things. And then the credits come up and they're in that old computer typeface.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and there are lots of movies that relate to this. Obviously, the Terminator movies. You've got episode. I'm sorry.
iRobot and Wally.
iRobot, Wally. There was an episode, at least one episode in the original Star Trek dealing with a computer that goes rogue and protects itself and such. So sure, there's always that concern as well. Personally, I would like to see a little bit more attempt at regulation with AI. Obviously you want AI to have its, opportunities to quickly improve and so on. But if you don't have guardrails, I do think that there can be issues of abuse and inappropriate usage, forming a variety of issues. Obviously, we don't want a situation like Terminator where the machines rise up against us. That said, I also see AI as something that can have a lot of beneficial uses in augmenting what humans need to help provide additional ideas, help humans just be more efficient on various concepts, coming up with a variety of things where it can be useful. It's just a matter of making sure that it's being handled in an appropriate and ethical way. So it's something where I certainly encourage people to try it out, play with it, use it, explore it, get comfortable with it. The more you know, the more you're able to use it in a appropriate, ethical way. The more times it's being used in an appropriate, ethical way, the better it gets trained on the information to act in a better, more professional, more ethical way as well, because it is learning with each iteration that you are going through of working with the AI. So, all right. So if there is no other questions, thank you all for coming in and listening to me. And hopefully I haven't scared anyone away from trying AI, hopefully encouraging some people to give it a shot and see what it's all about and how to use it.
Hey, Brian, this is Jody Gaskins.
Yes.
Do you have time for another question?
Absolutely.
Okay, it's actually two. And so
Okay.
2 and 1 is, I would just really like to hear from your perspective how AI is currently impacting your role at Temple College, your job, and even if you were a futurist and could look into the future and say, I think this is how my job will change because of AI, I'd be really interested in knowing the answer to that. My
Sure.
other question is, how do you, from a workforce perspective, how do you see AI impacting all jobs? And what could our workforce, our local workforce, need from us as a college to work with this AI concept? So 2 questions.
Yeah. So, I mean, certainly it is a very valid question of how AI will affect us and our jobs in the future. From my role as a librarian, I will say that there's been a lot of discussions of where AI might be useful and where it might not be so useful. One area certainly is in cataloging information, books, data, etc. And so far, the results are that AI doesn't do a very good job cataloging library information. It misses a lot of stuff. It can have hallucinations that make the result that the human has to basically go in and fix all the errors, and in which case, if someone is well trained at cataloging, they might have cataloged that faster if they didn't have to go, then if they have to go in and fix all the errors. On the other hand, it can provide a quick starting point that might enhance for the human cataloger, where they can then go in and just fill in the areas that the AI misses. So there's that aspect. Certainly the potential of AI being able to help provide patrons with information for their requests for research information, for finding materials, things like that. A lot of the database companies are starting to put in AI within their databases, where it's giving the user a bit of an advantage where they can go in, they can look at an article that they might think about using for their research paper or something like that, and it'll give them a little summary, the key points, things like that. So it helps the user then more quickly determine whether that article is going to be useful for them, by being able to just look at those quick points and go, oh, that's not quite what I'm looking for. And because that data is being trained on very specific information, that particular document is more likely to be accurate. That said, like I said in the past, previously, I have actually provided a document to AI, actually 2 different AIs, and they both failed miserably at summarizing that article. Hallucinating the entire thing, as a matter of fact, down to the title. Obviously, databases are going to want their product to be able to focus on their documents and actually provide accurate information. So I'm sure it's more specialized than a general AI like ChatGPT. In terms of workforce, that's a good question. I mean, there certainly are areas where AI is already affecting jobs, where it's analyzing information, or just a variety of things. And to be honest, I have not looked into a lot of the specifics on that area. I'm by no means an expert. I know just enough to be able to feel like I can comfortably present to everyone some of the basics. But it is something where I feel like it is going to affect some areas. But I also feel like that human interaction to make sure that the input is good and that the output is accurate is going to continue to be important for the foreseeable future. Again, like I said, AI is not at the point of being sentient, self-aware, being able to process and make that next step. So at this time, it's largely just making things more efficient. And maybe that's where some job losses to AI is happening, is that it's just making it more efficient. So instead of needing 10 people to analyze through the data, it takes 8 people.
Plus 2 more to figure out where the errors are.
Well, actually, that was part of where I was
I'm sorry.
going with the 8 people, that it's, part of what they are doing is analyzing it and finding the errors. So.
Yeah. Well, I greatly appreciate and value your opinion. Thanks for taking on both of those. I have one more. I just love your response to it. At the very beginning, you said that ChatGPT responds to like please and courteous communication. And when I first realized that, I wondered, I thought, what is that about? And I just wondering, I guess to know, is my assumption accurate? And please share if it's not, but I thought, is it trying to figure out how I like to be communicated with? So if I use courteous language, it will respond in nature? Or does it really behave differently based on my communication?
I think you're onto something there, and that I do think it is at least partially because of the expectation of human communication and trying to respond in that manner. And since it has been trained to respond in a way that humans appreciate, with some level of courtesy and such, it may be expecting that as part of its algorithm as well, that for it to respond in a courteous way, it expects you to interact with it in a courteous way as well. And yeah, and that would be the other aspect, is that the trainers with their biases may be putting in a preference for that courtesy.
Yeah.
I just want to interject if I can on that aspect. I've been reading a lot of articles lately that seem to be suggesting that ChatGPT and other generative AIs are seeking our approval in what responses they give us. And so I've seen some unfortunate headlines about people using different generative AIs as a therapist. And really, they just get stuck in this like confirmation bias cycle because the AI is just giving them what they want to hear. And so I think that that is also reflected in the types of responses we get just when we're asking it to do like little things. Like I've noticed, I use it sometimes to help me generate social media posts, and I will give it a specific tone that I want it to have. And it will continue to use that tone even when I'm not asking for it to generate a sample social media post. So, like, as I tell it what tone to use, it continues with that tone until I tell it something different. So, I find that something that's interesting.
Yeah, that is fascinating, and it's yeah. Thank you for jumping in. And Brian, kudos to you for pulling this together and putting it together. And I look forward to the next one. Hope it's soon.
Haven't put it on the calendar yet, but we'll be working on it. Yes. And the previous answer was, our response was from Mia Wilson, our awesome outreach and programming librarian, who is largely responsible for helping get a lot of this stuff out there. And she's awesome. And so feel free to communicate with her as well. She's very knowledgeable.
Thanks for the shout out, Brian.
Now I know not to use ChatGPT for therapy because it's going to just tell me what I want to hear.
Yeah. And there have been other issues where that have recently come up where it has suggested, especially to younger people, concepts about like suicide and things like that. And so that's very concerning as well. Self-harm. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, in person and online, for coming and attending this session. And we'll let you know as soon as we get the next one ready and on the calendar.
Good deal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.